Let me start. What are some structures, and you think about in the Bible, from the Old Testament maybe into the New? And what I mean by that, Noah's Ark. Okay, that was a structure we're very familiar with. The Tower of Babel. Structures we're familiar with. Can you think of any other structures that stand out in your mind that are often used to draw spiritual lessons? Okay, the Tabernacle of Moses. The Temple of Solomon. Okay, the brazen serpent, very small structure, but it was a structure nonetheless. Anything else? What about the walls of Jericho? Those are structures that came down, but still structures. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that Herod's temple, that's how we often refer to it. The Jews would never refer to it as Herod's temple. But the first century Jewish temple casts a shadow from the time of New Testament history even until today. Now, I want to just look at some things first with regards to the temple in history. You know, we first see the temple in the historical timeline of Jesus. John goes further back in the history of Christ. Well, he goes further back with Christ because he has Christ in eternity. But in the historical timeline, Luke goes further back in history of the life of Christ than any of the other gospel writers. In fact, Luke chapter 1 opens up in the temple. There we see Zacharias in the temple, and Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, the messenger of God, revealing to Zacharias of his son. And who was his son? John. These aren't difficult questions. John. And who was his mother? Elizabeth. Zacharias was a descendant of Aaron. He was of the tribe of Levi, descendant of Aaron. He was a priest. His mother Elizabeth was of the daughters of Aaron. John was doubly a descendant of Aaron, and he is the one that would prophesy, doubly descendant from the first high priest of God, who would prepare the way for the Christ, who would bring an end to the Levitical priesthood and established his own priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. All of this begins in the temple. I think it's also interesting that the book of Luke opens in the temple with Zacharias receiving revelation from God through Gabriel, God's messenger. The book of Luke ends, Luke chapter 24, verse 53, with the apostles daily in the temple, where they would soon receive revelation from the promised Comforter, where they would fully understand more of the true temple. And we're just in the first chapter, opening up. Some other parts of the shadow of the temple in the New Testament, Luke chapter 2, Jesus' presentation at the temple. Mary offering her sacrifice of her purification. There is Simeon. There is Anna, the prophetess. Luke chapter 4, Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is tempted of Satan in the wilderness, but he is brought to Jerusalem and tempted to throw himself off of the pinnacle of the temple. Scholars suggest that this would have been the area that was considered the pinnacle of the temple. Don't know for sure. Nevertheless, we see again that shadow of that temple. And I find this especially interesting. John chapter 2. This is the record of Jesus' earthly ministry beginning, John chapter 2. And what happens at the opening of Jesus' earthly ministry? I'm not talking about turning the water into wine, but what happens right after that in John chapter 2? Purifying the temple. How does Jesus' earthly ministry close? Luke chapter 19, Matthew, 21, Mark 11, closes with the purifying, the cleansing of the temple. Now, in Luke chapter 20, and when you take Luke chapter 20 and this particular day, that would be Tuesday, the day of the life, the last week of the life of Jesus Christ. And you put Luke 20 with Mark's account and Matthew's account, we have more information about that one single day in the life of Jesus than any other day of his life. It's often referred to as the day of questions. There are no less than 16 questions asked. Jesus asked the majority of them. And they all are tied in and have to do with authority. Now, Luke 19, Jesus has purified, cleansed the temple the second time, the close of his earthly ministry. In Luke 20, the Sadducees and those unbelieving Jews asked Jesus, what power or authority gives you the right to do these things? They're referring especially to that purifying of the temple because he got into their hip pocket. They lost their money. They lost their money changers. They lost the selling of the animals. And Jesus asked them a question. Now, Jesus is not asking them a question to avoid answering their question. He is not trying to be sly, knowing they wouldn't answer the question, therefore he wouldn't have to answer their question. He, in essence, says, you answer my question and you'll have an answer to your question. Baptism of John. Is it of heaven or of men? If they would have answered that correctly, they would have said the baptism of John is from heaven. Jesus, in turn, would have said, correct, and John prophesied of me as the Christ. And the one that commanded John to baptize is the same one that revealed and commanded him to prophesy or to proclaim me the Christ. There is the answer to your question. The authority by which I do these things is the authority of the Christ given me by my Father. Now, Jesus opens his ministry purifying the house of God. Jesus closes his ministry purifying the house of God, demonstrating, declaring for all time, I have authority over the house of my Father. Now, Hebrews chapter 3, Moses was faithful as a servant in his house, but Jesus as a son over his own house, whose house we are. Some of the last words Jesus ever said on this earth prior to his ascension, all power, all authority is given unto me. Now, see, we learn these things from the temple. We go to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 2. The true temple is established. There's the gospel being preached right there in the temple. Acts chapter 3, the lame man is healed at the beautiful gate. We're going to demonstrate where the beautiful gate is. Acts chapters 4 and 5, the apostles are brought before the council of the Sanhedrin. Acts chapter 6 and 7, Stephen is brought before the council of the Sanhedrin. Acts 21, 22, and 23. Here's Paul in the temple, falsely accused of bringing Trophimus, an Ephesian, a Greek, into the temple by those Jews from Ephesus. You know, Ephesus was a chief city of Asia, and so these Jews of Asia falsely claim they see Trophimus with Paul. He must have brought him in, falsely accused of bringing a Gentile past that wall of partition that Jesus would destroy when he nailed the old law to the cross. You see the imagery of the temple? In fact, the very nature of the church is a temple. You know, whenever we think about the nature of the church, and this is interesting, you know, just the word church tells us something about the nature of the body of Christ. The word church means what? Called out. We're called out of the darkness of the world by God, the gospel of his Son, into his marvelous light. In relation to the world, the church is called out. As to its government, the church is a kingdom. Jesus is King of kings and Lord of lords. We've been translated into the kingdom, Colossians chapter 1, 12 and 13. As to labor, the church is a vineyard. It's the vineyard of the Lord. You know, there are some things with regards to laboring in the vineyard. Number one, there's the responsibility of labor. Responsibility. Number two, there's the reward of labor. Someone says, well, you have a lot of gall to say that there's reward for you laboring in the vineyard of the Lord. No, that's not gall. That's faith in my God and my Savior who promised reward for those who labor in his vineyard. With regards to unity, the church is a body. There are many members, yet but one body. With regards to fidelity, faithfulness, devotion, the church is a bride of Christ. But as to worship, the church is a temple. Now, when there is a temple, there are certain things that are absolutely necessary. One of the things is deity. If there's a temple, there's a deity that's worshipped in that temple. In addition to that, there is a priesthood, which implies two other things. There's a high priest, and then the priests under that high priest. And what do those priests do? They're offering sacrifices through their high priest to God. Okay, let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2 and watch this. We're talking about the temple, okay? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, he also is lively stones, living building stones. What's the foundation stone? Jesus Christ. We're built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. That is, that foundation that they laid, which is Christ. Because there's no other foundation any man can lay than that which is already laid, which is Jesus Christ. And the foundation that they built upon that is the gospel of Christ. And so ye also as living building stones. Now here's a thought. As Christians, we are living building stones in the temple of God. You ever look around and say, my brother or sister's not here. I need to check on them and make sure things are okay. And if they're not, I need to see if I can satisfy a need. And if they're falling by the wayside, I need to strengthen the feeble knees. Or do we just say, well, brother, sister, so-and-so's not here, and after a year, after 2, after 4, after 8, after 10, after 20, what happened to all the living building stones in the body of Christ? Let me tell you what, you ever play Jenga? Isn't that the game where you pull out the wood? You start pulling out the building stones out of the local congregation, out of the Lord's church. What's going to happen to that local congregation? It's not going to stand. We have responsibility to each other. Well, living building stones, ye also as lively stones, are built up, what? A spiritual house. What's that? That's a temple. All right, so there's a temple. What's necessary? Watch it. You're built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. There we are. To offer up spiritual sacrifices. There they are, to God, acceptable to God, through our high priest, Jesus Christ. See, we talk about the temple. There are so many lessons. The first century temple cast a shadow. The very nature of the church is a temple. Go back to the Old Testament, Psalm 110, verse 4. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Well, he was what, a high priest? What's the implication there? We're talking about the Lord's church. We're talking about the true temple of God. Zechariah chapter 6, 12 and 13. Jesus would be the branch, that's the Christ, would be a king, and on his throne, what else would he be? A priest, a high priest. You know, those two verses, Zechariah 6, 12 and 13, mark it down, forever destroy, cuts off at the knees premillennial doctrine that says Jesus will return to this earth, he will establish his kingdom on this earth and reign as king, and he'll establish the old law again. Well, according to Zechariah, a prophet of God, on his throne, he'll also be a high priest. But if he reestablishes the law of Moses, he can't be a high priest because he's not of the tribe of Levi. Just those two verses alone completely destroy premillennial doctrine. But it foretells of Christ on his throne as a high priest over his house, which house we are, the temple. Malachi chapter 3. Let's just go to Malachi chapter 3. And let's just read this because it's talking about John and then it goes into the Christ. Right? Malachi chapter 3 verse 1. Behold, I will send my messenger and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek, he shall come or suddenly come to what? His temple. And Haggai chapter 2 verse 9 said that a latter temple, the magnificence of it would be greater than the former. I want to tell you something. See this temple in the first century right here? In Tennessee, we'd say, that ain't the temple that Haggai was talking about. He's talking about the Lord's church. Nevertheless, the nature of the church is as a temple with regards to worship. I want, for the time that we have remaining, consider in large part history. That was my time for preaching. Consider some history. I want us to know the history and the background of the temple, just briefly. Who was it that had the idea to build this temple? Who was the instigator behind it? Who was the architect of this temple? Why did it come into existence? So we'll notice a little bit of that briefly. Then look at some unique facts and features. I appreciate the assignment of this lesson because I learned so much about this building, this structure. Some things we will not cover that you have in your outline. Scenes in the temple. We just don't have time to deal with all that. But I tried to provide, hopefully, every instance in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts where there was a scene in the temple. And so you have kind of a quick, ready reference of that. Then the church as a temple, well, we've already noted that. A little bit more information in the outline. The destruction of the temple in the year 70 by the Roman Empire, first initiated by Vespasian, then finished by his son Titus. There is a YouTube channel called Kings and Generals, and there's about a 20 to 25 minute video of the destruction of the temple. It's not a religious channel, it's just a historical channel that deals with ancient battles, and one of those ancient battles is Rome's destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. I highly recommend you watch that. I think I've got the link in the outline. It's there. But it's Kings and Generals on YouTube. Watch that and then read Matthew 24 and Luke 21. And you just watch it. And you see the history, and then you read the prophecy, and you see how all the symbolic language just falls right into place. We won't have time really to talk about that. But I provided an outline of that documentary in your notes, so you can take advantage of that. And if time allows, we'll look at the magnificence of the temple, not the magnificence of Herod's or the first century Jewish temple, but the magnificence of the true temple. Time allows. All right, let's get down to it. In his 18th year, the 18th year of his reign, that'd be about 19 BC, Herod decided to build a temple, and he told Israel, he told the Jews, this will be a temple for your name, this will be a temple for you, and it will magnify you. Well, if you know anything about Herod, you know he wanted to magnify himself. It's not really called the Jewish temple today, except by those of Israel today. We refer to it as Herod's temple. Nevertheless, he addresses the people. Well, what do you suppose was the reaction when Herod said, I want to remove your temple. I want to level it, and I want to build another one. Well, it didn't go over too good. And so they rejected. It wasn't an outright rebellion, but they pushed back. Herod promised, before we begin construction on the temple, we will gather all of the pieces that we need to build the temple, to construct the temple. He hired 10,000 workers. He had 1,000 who were priests that he trained to be carpenters, to be stonemasons, artificers, so that they could work in those holy places, that it wouldn't be those who were not of the Levitical tribe, the Levitical priesthood. And so you can see here all of this was put together. The people finally agreed. It took about 18 months to build the temple. Now, let me emphasize something. When we say the word temple, our mind may go to that one building that was the holy place and most holy place. The majority of the time in the New Testament, in the historical record, when you read the word temple, it's not necessarily talking about that. It's talking about the Temple Mount. Some people refer to it as a precinct. Some people refer to it as a plaza. It was 1.55 million square feet. And the temple was on that, and the sanctuary, and the courts, and the chambers, okay? And we'll get into a little bit more detail about that. But it took 18 months to build the temple proper, only 18 months. 8 years to build the remaining part of the sanctuary, the courts, the court of women, court of the priests, the chambers that were there. We'll notice some of those. And then 46 years total with the Temple Mount altogether. It was built on Mount Moriah, same place that Solomon's temple was built. Josephus, the Jewish historian, said that the temple was built on the exact spot where Abraham offered up Isaac. Well, we don't know that, but it was on Mount Moriah, nonetheless, where the temple was built. Now, you can look and see, not very conducive to build a 1.55 million square foot structure. You know, Herod was a great builder and a great architect. Read about Caesarea Maritima and his construction of that. A great builder. And so his plan was to first build walls and then substructures. On that substructure, then you'd put the platform. When that platform was completely finished, then the temple. And all of the porches or porticos and this royal porch, all of the sanctuary all around that. Okay? All of that total 46 years. The wall. Have you ever heard of the Wailing Wall? You see images maybe on the news today, the Wailing Wall. We step back. This is the east side, east wall. The far side, the west wall. Well, the Wailing Wall was a part of the west wall. Here's an image of that. And you can see, with relation to the people here, you can see the scale of the size of the wall. Well, of that part that remains, how would it fit into the west wall at that time? Well, here, this gives you an idea. The wall in totality, 1,640 feet. The Wailing Wall is only 187 feet. Now, you kind of get an idea of the sheer size of the Temple Mount. Okay? What about the stones? How did they acquire all this? Well, first of all, let's just talk about some of the size of the stones for the wall itself. Now, I swallowed hard and I did a double take and I read multiple sources because it just sounded too large to be true. The largest stone that has been discovered that was a part of the wall, not a part of the temple, okay, but a part of that part of the wall that was built so that the structure could be placed upon it, was 600 metric tons is the size of that stone. I'm going to suggest to you that was probably poured concrete. Okay. They didn't carve that out of marble. It's going to be on the ground anyway. Nevertheless, the largest stone, 600 metric tons. Well, you know, I live by standard measure, so I looked that up. 630 U.S. tons. That's over 1 million pounds. So again, you get the idea of the structure. Now, the stones that were used to build the temple itself, much smaller in scale. Okay? Also, the quarry from which these stones were taken was at an elevation from the Temple Mount about 125 feet. So moving the stones from the quarry to where they ultimately would be was downhill. Okay? So that aided. But here's how they would transport these. You'd see they would put them on carts drawn by beasts of burden. I thought this was interesting. They would build wheels around them. And then they could have them hauled that way. They would use logs, log rollers, hooked with teams and men pushing to get them from one place to another, all depending on the size of the stone, how they would use it. This also, these notches, and you can see them here, they're pushing them. They stayed on until they got set in place. Those then were removed so that everything was just immaculate, just right, just perfect. They had cranes. You can't really see it from this image. There are men inside of here that are walking that up to help to elevate this. You see this one way up here. You see people pushing this. I have to assume there would be something helping them pull that up. 3 or 4 men not pushing that up, rampart. These men here that are setting this into place, you can see it there more clearly. And then these stones then set into place. These would be removed. This is what they started with. Remember, Solomon's temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. When the people returned from captivity, in the time of Zerubbabel, the temple was rebuilt. Solomon said, I want to remove this one and build a new one. They started with this. Herod finished with that. 1.55 million square feet. It is said that the Temple Mount, here you have the court of the Gentiles, this would be the Soreg, the wall of partition. All of these areas would hold between 70,000 upwards to, some suggest 100,000 people at a time. You're talking about a massive structure. a massive structure. I want to talk about the gates. We want to talk about the courts in the temple area, the Temple Mount. Then I want to get into the sanctuary. Here you see the Castle of Antonia. This is the temple. We're going to talk about all of this area here. Go back. We want to talk about everything on the surrounding first, then the temple sanctuary itself, some of the specific details about that. It will enlighten us with regards to some figurative language that's used. We don't even understand it's figurative from Christ. Then we'll look at more specifically the temple. If we have time, maybe we'll, maybe we won't, we'll look at the magnificence of the true temple in comparison. All right, let's talk about the gates. Josephus said that there were 7 gates in the temple. Some suggest there's as many as 12. Josephus mentioned 7. On the west side, let me show you where we are. This is the east side. This would have been the side the most easily accessible from the Mount of Olives. There was only one gate here. On the west side, there were 4, nothing on the north, 2 on the south. Let's look at them. 4 on this would be the north side, down here the south. On the most northerly side, there was 1 gate. When we talk about a gate, I think about a gate that, is hinged on one side and opens on the other. Think more of just an opening that would have maybe large doors. The beautiful gate, is said, took 20 men to open it. It was so large. So there would be 1 in the most northerly corner, 2 in the center. Here you see how this would go down into the suburbs for quick access for the population. And then on this southerly corner, there was 1 gate. It was the most magnificent of all of the gates. It would lead to the royal porch. And you see that it would come down. This would have been the gate, or the bridge. This would be the bridge that the Pharisees would have led Jesus from the council to Pilate. This is from out of this gate down this bridge. If you're looking up on the corner, we're up on the southwest corner. We're looking down into the city. If we turn and look toward the temple, this is what we see. This is the royal porch. This is the court of the Gentiles. Another area here open for Jews only, the temple. On the south side, 2 gates. 2 gates. 1 is used specifically for an entrance, 1 specifically for an exit. However, you could go in the outdoor. You ever go in the outdoor and everybody look at you strange, like we don't even know where he's going? It was allowed that you could go into the exit if you were going in with trials and tribulations. You would dress a particular way. People would see by your demeanor, and their response was to be one of kindness and sympathy. Other than that, the requirement was you go into the inner. Now, these gates, when you would enter into these, you see it kind of comes up underneath this particular portico. When you would come up into the Temple Mount itself, this would have been that wall of partition as this artist has it pictured. This is what you would see. Across of it would be, you were coming up here, going out there. Now, let's look at it. Well, I must have deleted a particular slide I wanted. All right, I want to go back and give something about these. These 2 gates, they were known as the Huldah gates. Huldah, the prophetess, who was referred to as the keeper of the wardrobe. This gate was called the double gate. Guess why it was called the double gate? Had two doors. This gate is called the triple gate. Guess why it's called the triple gate? Now that'd be a good test question, wouldn't it? Why is it called the double gate? Why is it called triple gate? That would be a bonus question right there. And so those were the Huldah gates. This is the royal porch. This is the royal porch. If we were standing on top of the temple itself, we would be looking to the south. This would be what would be referred to as the royal porch or portico. all around the temple, on all sides, north, south, east, and west, there were porches. Now, we think about a porch sitting on the front porch, drinking a glass of sweet tea. Most likely going to be roofed, but not all porches are roofed. Well, you can see these porches ran the length of every side, okay? This was the one that was the most magnificent. We'll talk about it and show why. Here is a closer view of that royal porch. You would come into that royal porch from the southwest corner. Remember the bridge? I said that scholars say this is the bridge that they would have led Jesus across from the council to Pilate. Coming in from that particular bridge, you would have come into the area of the royal porch. When you come into it, it would look like this. I want you to notice these columns. The royal porch spanned the entirety on the south wall from the east to the west, the entirety of it. There were 162 of these marble columns, 162. And these columns were not pieced together, according to Josephus. They weren't pieced together as they constructed. Each one of these 162 columns were cut from a single piece of marble. 162. The size of them, it would take 3 men standing with arms outstretched, hand to hand, to encircle one of these columns. Amazing. The magnificence of this particular temple. We're standing now on the southeast corner. Here is that royal porch, royal portico. This would have been that pinnacle of the temple that scholars suggest that Jesus was tempted to cast himself from. Looking down into the temple sanctuary, this being the temple. The east wall, only one entrance, and there was a bridge that would run along this wall up to that entrance. That entrance came into Solomon's porch. Solomon's porch. Now, I want to spend some time first talking about this outer court, the court of the Gentiles here. Can you view that line right there? On this far side also, that's about a little over 5 feet high, fence, so to speak. A wall past which Gentiles were not allowed to pass. There was written, stationed, equal distance apart, signs warning those who were not of Israel, if they passed, it would be their life. Paul was accused of bringing Trophimus past that. Notice they didn't go after Trophimus. This would be the court of the Gentiles here. This court, this open area for Jews alone, was really just kind of an extra barrier between the Gentiles and the temple. Now think about this. I'm a Gentile and I want to be in the temple during the time of worship. I want to be there. I want to see the priest. I want to see the high priest go into the temple of my God. No, you have to stay. Well, can I stay out here and look inside? No, you can't even look inside. Well, can I at least come in and get a little bit closer? You can't even get close. I tell you what, we'll let you just poke your head in right here. And this is the area, this court of the Gentiles was the area where they would sell the animals, where the money changers would be set up. But what did Christ do? He broke down that middle wall of partition. So that now we not only can be in the court, we are a part of the temple as one of the living building stones. That's what Christ did for us. Now, I want to look at the temple, the sanctuary itself, some of the chambers and the courts. Okay, here you see kind of a illustration of the temple as a whole. We're going to focus on this bottom area first. Now, the east gate, again, the temple faced east. Sun rises from where? East. The temple was of marble. The top of it was plated with gold, and the gold would come down so far on the front. It is said that when the sun would come up, that the temple looked like a mountain of snow plated with gold. So much so that you could not even hardly look at the temple with the sun shining on it because of the brightness of it. But the brightness of that temple doesn't even come close to the brightness of the temple of God, of which we are part. Also on the Mount of Olives, which is going to be just a distance from, east from the opening of the temple, Jesus ascended up to heaven. All in view of that temple, or they were in view of that temple as Christ ascended. All right, let's get down to it here. This east gate, as it's referred to here, Acts chapter 3, Peter and John go into the temple. And at this gate, this is the gate that's called the Beautiful Gate. The Beautiful Gate. It is said that those gates were so large that it took 20 men to open and to close the doors of that gate. Entering into the east gate, the court of women. It's not called the court of women because only women could go in. It's called court of women because that is the extent to which women could enter into the temple. They could go no further than this particular court. Now, in this court also was the treasury. Jesus saw a widow cast in 2 mites. Okay, this is in the treasury. On the north side, on the south side, these would be called porches, porticos. On the north side and the south side was the treasury. The treasury, and I've got this in some detail in your outline. The treasury was really simply receptacles, 13 receptacles, where one would put their money. We pass a tray. They would go and put their money in. Each receptacle was dedicated for a particular work or part of the temple. If you wanted to give money for the wood, we need to buy wood. If you want to give money for animals. So whatever, if it was for a benevolent cause, for the needy, for the widows, well, you would find that particular receptacle and you'd put your money in. I'm going to just kind of poll everybody. Let's get a little bit closer view. I don't know how well you can see. Can somebody just tell me what this looks like? Forget the box. Does that resemble anything at all? An hourglass, a chalice? What did Jesus say that the hypocrites do when they cast in their alms? They sound the trumpet. The Talmud referred to these receptacles as the trumpets. So Jesus is using that figurative known language, making an application, teaching a lesson of a trumpet being blown as they place their money into the trumpet so that all could see them. So you have the treasury on either side, north and south. Come back and let's look at these chambers. 4 chambers, 1 in each corner of the court of women. There's the chamber of the woodshed. Guess what they kept in that chamber? Wood. You know, not every Levite was able to serve as a priest. What if they had a deformity? What if they had a blemish? And so those who weren't allowed, because of the law, to perform as priests, they then would be in this chamber separating the wood that was good from the wood that was rotten, the wormwood, so that bad wood would not get into the fire for the sacrifices. The chamber of lepers. What were lepers to do if their leprosy was cleansed, if their leprosy was gone, if they made it through the leprosy? They were to present themselves to the priest. They would come to the chamber of lepers. They would prepare their sacrifice, and they would present it to the priest at the gate. And they then would be pronounced clean by the priest. The chamber of the house of oil. Joel talks about the meat offering and the drink offering is cut off from the house of the Lord, Joel chapter 1. Said the vine is wasted, and the oil or the new wine is dried up. The wheat is wasted, the new wine is dried up, the oil languisheth. Well, that wine and oil that was used in sacrifices in the drink offering was put together and stored in this particular chamber. And this chamber, the chamber of the Nazarites. Well, the Nazarites were people who what? Made a vow, okay? They made a vow. When the Nazarite had fulfilled his vow, he would come to the chamber of Nazarites, he would poll his hair, he would prepare his peace offering, and then present it to the priest. 5 minutes, okay. Thought you were wanting something for a minute. We're going to at least get the temple done. Now, the Nicanor gate. Notice these are supposed to be priests here. 15 steps going up to the Nicanor gate. How many psalms of degrees are there? And so the psalm of degrees then would be sung on these steps, the Nicanor gate. Now, let's go into the west side of the temple sanctuary. You can't see it. It's not identified. Walking through the Nicanor gate, and only the males could go through that. The women could go no further. But going through was the court of Israel. And it was really kind of a narrow strip, considering the size. And the men could go into this area. All right, now let's zoom in a little bit closer. The place of slaughtering. This is where the animals were killed, skinned, prepared for the sacrifice. We see the altar where the animals would be sacrificed. The laver where the priest would wash. The size of the laver, it said, was of such size that 12 priests could stand around it at one time, washing, cleansing themselves, preparing themselves. The chamber of the hearth was a place where provided a table and place to eat. These chambers also provided places of storage, apartments where the priests could stay while they were fulfilling their course. But these also were places of storage and residence. But this is the chamber of hewn stone that to me is the most significant of everything. I'd never really given it much thought until I was given the opportunity to study this in some depth. You know, Jesus was taken in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was taken to the house of the high priest in a mock trial. All of them really were mock trials. But then it had to be legitimate. And so, as the sun was coming up, because they couldn't do a legitimate trial at night in the council, so as the sun was coming up, a new day, they bring Jesus to the council. They bring him before their council. If that means, as it does everywhere else that we read, that Jesus went before their council in the place of their council, they took Jesus to the chamber of hewn stone where the Sanhedrin council met. And as Jesus is being tried to be a sacrifice for all of humanity, he is in sight of the place of slaughtering where the sacrifices for the morning sacrifice is being prepared, which typify his ultimate sacrifice. And the altar of burnt offering is in eye view of Christ, which typified from its beginning of his ultimate sacrifice. We never really realize those things till we see the temple. Castle of Antonia, Acts chapters 21, 22, and 23. The castle, it was a fortress, a barracks. This was on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. It would house about 1,000 Roman soldiers. When Paul is teaching, and first he's falsely accused. They want to tear him limb from limb. He then begins to speak. The violence and the chaos is so great that the Roman soldiers that are housed here, they come running down these steps to save the life of Paul. They have to pick him up over the people. They have such a desire to kill the man. And so he resides here for a period of time until it's found out about a scheme and a conspiracy to kill him, which he is taken to Caesarea, where he stays for 2 years. Let's go to the top of the Castle of Antonia. Served as a fortress, barracks. The top of the Castle of Antonia, you could see out over the Temple Mount. We're looking from the northwest corner toward the southeast corner. Let's turn. What do we see? You can see the whole of the city. Whole of the city. Well, wish we had time to talk about the magnificence of the true temple, but our time is up. Maybe another time. Nevertheless, I appreciate your time and your attention. Yeah, man, it was fun. Hey, it's not tell you,
That's a great study.
It was.
Yes. All right, we do have just a couple of announcements. This will be the lunch hour. Brother Kennedy, Trinity, where are you at? There you go. Would you come up here and be ready to lead us in a word of prayer? Give thanks for the meal that we're about to partake of. Appreciate that. A couple of announcements. Number one, I need to make the announcement that tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. there's a prayer meeting up here at the building. If you would like to join in that prayer meeting so that we might offer prayers for the many works that are assembled here, and we would love to have you join us for that particular event. Also, I was thinking about that chamber of the woodshed, and he asked what was in there. My answer must have been belts and switches, because that's what my dad always took me to, was the woodshed. So I guess I had that wrong, and excellent lesson. I guarantee you could study this for a year and have a great study in a local congregation on the temple and things in relationship to that. But we're going to have